So what we've got today is completing the square, and so this is another method that you can solve your quadratics, and it works every single time. It is a little more complicated, but if you get it now, then when you start looking at equations of circles and conic sections later, you'll already be golden on completing the square, and it'll be super helpful. So I've listed out all of your steps, so the more you do it, the more familiar you'll be with it. So the first step is to move all constants to the right side of the equal sign. So that just means your C value, that means your constant, your number. After that, you want to make sure your leading coefficient, so the value in front of x squared, you want to make sure it's 1. If it's not, we'll divide it out. Next step is to divide your B value by 2 and square it, and then add it to both sides. So this is how we're going to get a perfect square trinomial, and that's important so that in the next step, we can write a perfect square binomial. And that's what it's going to look like. We're going to have something plus or minus something else squared. And then from there, all you want to do is solve it. So those are your steps. So let's look at a couple of examples going through those steps. So the first one is x squared plus 10x minus 48 equals 0. So following those steps, step 1 says to move all constants to the right side of the equal. So we'll do that. We'll add 48 to both sides. Okay, the next step says to make sure the coefficient of x squared is 1. Well, my coefficient over here is 1, so we're good to go. Step 3 says divide the b value by 2, square the result, and add to both sides. So if you think about factoring it, that b value is on bottom. We're going to cut it in half. So those two numbers added together give you 10, but those two numbers multiplied or squared gives you 25. So that 25 is what we're going to add to both sides. And because we're dealing with math and equals, everything is equal. So if you add it to the left side, you have to add it to the right side. And once you've done that, you're going to write the left side as a perfect square binomial. So we're going to have x plus 5 squared. And if you FOIL that out, you should get x squared plus 10x plus 25. And you'll have 48 plus 25 on the other side. And you can go ahead and simplify that. You don't really need to keep writing it out. And so after that, all you have to do is solve. So we're going to get x by itself. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we'll have x plus 5 equals the plus or minus value of the square root of 73. And last step, we'll subtract 5 from both sides. And so x is negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 73. And that just means that it's crossing the x-axis at this value. So that is a decimal, so it's not exact. But that's your completing the square. We'll look at another example. So it is 6x squared equals 12x plus 90. And so that step 1 tells me that I need to move the constant to the right side of the equals. And that constant needs to be by itself. So in this case, what we actually need to do is move this 12x over to the other side. So we'll have 6x minus 12x equals 90. Step 2 says to make the coefficient of x squared 1. Well, my coefficient right now is 6. And so to get rid of it, we're going to divide every single term by 6. And so we'll have an x squared minus 2x, and then that 90 divided by 6 gives me 15. So we've taken care of step 2. Step 3 says to divide the b value by 2, square the result, and add to both sides. So over here, if we think about it like we're factoring, we've got negative 2 on the bottom, the b value on the bottom. If we split it in half, we'll have a negative 1 on both sides. And if we multiply them, we get a positive 1. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. And when we do that, the next step is to write the left side as a perfect square binomial. So we'll have x minus 1 squared equals 16. Remember, this minus 1 is just half of b. So if b is negative 2, half of negative 2 is negative 1. it'll look just like this. And if you FOIL this x minus 1 squared out, you'll get x squared minus 2x plus 1. And then last steps, we'll solve. So we'll take the square root of both sides. The square root of 16 is plus or minus 4. It's really important not to forget that you have a positive and negative solution. And so we'll have an x equals, we add 1 to both sides, 1 plus or minus 4. And so we know that simplifies, so we'll have 1 plus 4 and 1 minus 4, and so we end up with a 5 and negative 3. We'll do a couple more examples, maybe 2 more. The more you work with it, the more familiar it becomes. So let's look at this one. So negative 3n squared minus 14n plus 60 equals 11 minus 4n squared. So again, following those steps, we want to move all constants to the right side. So in this case, we're going to move the 60, subtract 60 from both sides, but we also need to move this 4n squared. And so when we simplify that, we've got n squared minus 14n equals 11 minus 60, negative 49, negative. And so my coefficient of that leading term, that n squared is 1. We're good to go. We're going to divide b by 2, square the result, and add to both sides. So we'll have negative 14 on bottom, half it, and multiply those two together, 49. So we're actually adding 49 to both sides. Okay, so then we'll write it as a perfect square binomial. So we'll have n minus 7 squared equals 0. Take the square root of both sides. Plus or minus 0 is just 0. Add 7 to both sides, and so we get one solution that n is 7. All right, we'll look at another one. How about 2x squared minus 16x plus 14 equals 10. Step 1 says to move all the constants to the right side, so we'll subtract 14 from both sides. And then I need to make sure the coefficient of x squared is 1. So we'll divide everything out by 2. So we'll have x squared minus 8x equals a negative 2. And then we can divide b by 2, square the result, add to both sides. So negative 8 cut in half is negative 4. Negative 4 times negative 4 is a positive 16. We will add 16 to both sides if I can fit it in. And then we'll write a perfect square binomial. So we'll have x minus 4 squared equals 14. And then we'll just solve. So we'll take the square root of both sides. Remember, when you take the square root, it's plus or minus. And then we'll add 4 to both sides. And so x ends up being 4 plus or minus the square root of 14. And so that's a really quick review of completing the square.